In this video, we're going to talk briefly about the big crash, the one that happened in roughly 2007, 2008. This was the home mortgage crisis. So let's think about how this all happens, right? I mean, if you wanted to buy a house, where would you go to get the money, right? So could you find a person who could lend you the money to buy the entire house? And of course, obviously, you couldn't. Very few investors would have enough money to give you the entire amount of cash to buy that asset. In addition, who's going to be there to make sure that the borrower makes payments? So there's lots of challenges if we try to do this individually. So savings and loans, right? Being back in the 1970s, certainly before 1980s, savings and loans were there to help us with this issue. Investors were depositing money in S&Ls, and S&Ls then had the expertise to be able to evaluate the riskiness of borrowers. And of course, they have the legal resources to force collection of payment. So S&Ls were a perfect step, if you will, in our ability to buy and sell houses in the market. And the more efficient they are, the easier it is, obviously, for the economy to manage the housing market. Now, what happened was that if you think about the money that goes into an S&L, most of the money that goes into the S&L is short term, right? So there are things like checking accounts, some savings accounts, some CDs, right? But the loans that they make are all very long term. So there is a glitch in the system, if you will, where there's not a good match in time and life between the deposits, the money that's coming in, and the money that's going out. So what happens here then obviously is we have some challenges as the economy changes. What happens to this business when things like interest rates change? So if interest rates go up, then S&Ls have a problem because they're paying their depositors more. They have to pay their depositors more than what they were collecting from their mortgages. So there again is this business model disconnect. And what happened in the 1980s, we had a relaxation of some regulation. And this relaxation now basically removed interest rate controls. So interest rates then could increase and go up as high as what the market would take them. And we found out that there were then some people who had variable rate mortgages. They couldn't get out of them for one reason or another, bad credit, etc. But essentially they couldn't get out of the loans. So they end up paying maybe 16, 17, 18% on their mortgage for a while, which obviously is very, very expensive, right? So what happens, a lot of S&Ls went bankrupt because their client base was going bankrupt. Now these deposits are insured, and taxpayers, ultimately, because we insure them, paying back hundreds of billions of dollars to bring the accounts back to zero, if you will. So we want to talk about how does this actually work now in the marketplace. S&Ls are basically a thing of the past. If you look around, you'll see very few S&Ls. That's because most of them went out of business in the middle of the 1980s, or they were purchased by other commercial banks. Now, securitization is a process where businesses come in and they buy the mortgages from S&Ls or from the banks. So there are several companies: Fannie Mae, FNMMA, Ginnie Mae, and Freddie Mac. These are the three primary companies that they go into banks, whether they be mortgage generators or whether they be S&Ls or commercial banks, and they buy pools of mutual funds. And they then sell, after the S&Ls sell their mortgages to these companies. Of course, they receive money because they sold something. Then they have more money that they can lend to more houses. So what has happened here is that the riskiness of the investment has shifted way back when from the individual. Now it was shifted, then the S&Ls were taking a brunt of the risk, and now that risk is shifted to these other companies as they manage the mortgages. Now, this risk hasn't gone away. Again, it has just shifted. But Fannie Mae doesn't keep the mortgages either. They again put these mortgages in pools, and then they sell shares of those pools to investors. So now guess who gets to have the risk? Now the risk is shifted to investors. Now, of course, they're going to get a rate of return. It's going to be very close to the mortgage rate. That mortgage rate is typically higher than the rate that S&Ls paid their depositors. So investors are getting a higher return than if they had been in the S&L business model, if you will. So investors have more risk, and of course, we've talked about this a little bit so far. That means they're also going to want more returns. This is called securitization. And securitization, again, is all about creating securities that represent a pool of investments. And then that money is then paid to investors. So what these companies do is they create things called collateralized debt obligations. So again, they split these pools, and now they're going to split the securities even further. So some securities that they sell might only pay interest. Some securities might pay only mortgage. Some may mature quickly, others may mature later. Some securities are senior, right? They get paid a little bit before any other securities in a pool are paid. Now, the challenge with these CDOs is rating agencies have to figure a way to assess the risk of these different types of securities that are created. So the risk of the business basic mortgage is parceled out to investors who want that type of risk, right? They want the risk associated with interest, or they want risk associated with the time element or mortgages, right? So again, the risk shifts, and now it's broken down into other pieces. Other assets can be securitized as well. Car loans, student loans. Everybody's heard of Sally Mae. You can even buy credit card balances that are invest in securities that are securitized from credit cards. Now, what happened that went bad in the industry, right? What happened? Well, the challenge was that there's a lot of money to be made, and companies, typically mortgage brokers, are paid for every mortgage they close. So they really didn't care whether you could make payments or not. So it turns out that many of these institutions jumped on the bandwagon and started selling mortgages to people, right, that couldn't afford the homes that they were buying. So now think about this. We have companies that are selling mortgages, right? So they're lending money out to people. They're then selling those mortgages to companies like Fannie Mae, Ginnie Mae, Freddie Mac. But those entities, those mortgages, were very risky. Some of them were referred to what you refer to as subprime. So subprime mortgages are those kinds of mortgages that have some inherent risk that others do not. For instance, if you buy a house with zero money down, that's called a subprime loan. Why? Because you have no equity when you start. And the equity is going to grow very slowly as you're making payments. So what happens if you don't make the payments? What happens if you default? That then filters down through the rest of the investment stream now through these CDOs and ultimately to the original investors. So again, investment banks created these CDOs. They got rating agencies to help them design and rate them, which, by the way, was a major conflict of interest. And then they found ways to insure them, right? So some investors ultimately bought insurance via something called a credit default risk. But essentially, the overall issue that while the mortgages had varying levels of risk, when they were split into these CDOs, it was kind of like making gravy. You know, once you make gravy, you can't unmake gravy. So there in this pool of gravy, there are mortgages that are being defaulted by individuals. Individuals have probably had no business buying a house anyhow, right? In fact, they gave loans to individuals that didn't require them to prove they even had a job, right? So again, once you've created this mixture, you can't pull out the parts that are now bad, right? So there's no way to take the poor investments that have defaulted out of these pools. So what then created was the market collapsed because these CDOs started to default. And a lot of the many originators and the securitizers own these subprime securities, right? So there's lots of bankruptcies, lots of government takeovers, fire sales, lots of companies went out of business. And if you look again, the two that I'm really familiar with are these two at the top are mortgage brokers. And essentially these mortgage brokers, they just, in my opinion, they just weren't good people. They were taking advantage of individuals who wanted to do something. Some could, some couldn't, but they were taking advantage of individuals who maybe just weren't quite ready to buy a house yet. Now, some of these other companies, Bear Stearns, Lehman Brothers, they took major hits. Some of them went out of business with this mortgage market. So again, the whole idea, the reason we talk about this is risk is everywhere. And if we don't understand it, and if it's not properly valued and assessed, then we can end up with problems like these mortgage issues. Again, where the mortgage industry is such a huge part of our economy. When it stumbled, the entire economy stumbled. So again, that's the end of our video today. Look forward to seeing you soon. Bye-bye.